The smell arrived during the lunch rush, subtle as a whisper beneath the cacophony of clinking plates and overlapping conversations. Maya Reyes noticed it first. A faint sweetness cutting through the grease-thick air of the Bluebird diner, like rotten eggs masked by something chemical and wrong. She paused mid-step, balancing 3 plates along her left arm, while her right hand gripped a coffee pot still steaming at the spout. The scent made her nostrils flare, made something in the back of her mind begin to tick like a metronome counting down. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maya, Table 7's getting antsy, called Rick from behind the grill. His voice muffled by the sizzle of bacon and the mechanical whir of the ventilation hood that hadn't worked properly in months. He didn't smell it yet. Nobody did. The diner was too loud, too alive with the Thursday afternoon crowd. Truckers hunched over chili bowls, construction workers sharing cigarettes by the door, a young mother trying to corral 2 children while her coffee went cold. Maya stood frozen in the center of it all, plates growing heavy against her forearm, while her brain performed rapid calculations she hadn't asked it to make. She set the plates down at table 4 with mechanical precision, her smile automatic as she refilled water glasses and promised the apple pie would be out soon. But her mind was elsewhere, traveling back 7 years to a cramped classroom at Denver Community College, to Professor Hartman's weathered hands drawing molecular structures on a whiteboard, to the day they discussed volatile organic compounds and the particular danger of mercaptan additives in natural gas. The human nose could detect it at concentrations as low as 1 part per billion, he'd said. It was added deliberately, a safety measure, because natural gas itself was odorless. If you could smell it, you needed to act. Maya moved toward the kitchen, her steps measured, fighting the urge to run. She caught her reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser as she passed. 29 years old but looking older under the fluorescent lights, dark hair pulled back in a bun that had loosened during the rush, her Bluebird Diner name tag slightly crooked above her heart. She'd worn this uniform for 3 years, since the research grant dried up and her graduate studies became a luxury she could no longer afford. Her mother's medical bills had seen to that, the mounting costs of chemotherapy that hadn't worked, that had taken everything and left Maya with student loans, an incomplete chemistry degree, and a job serving eggs to people who never asked about her dreams. But those dreams hadn't died completely. They lived in the way she noticed things, the precise temperature at which the coffee began to burn, the chemical reaction between baking soda and vinegar that Rick used to clean the drains, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the grill that spoke to convection currents and thermal dynamics. She'd learned to translate the world into formulas and reactions, even as she carried plates and smiled through exhaustion. It was a language she spoke fluently, silently, while the rest of the world ordered burgers and complained about the weather. The smell was stronger in the kitchen. Maya pushed through the swinging door and found Rick flipping pancakes, his back to her, while Dolores, the dishwasher, scrubbed at a stubborn pot in the corner. The woman was 72 years old and had worked at the Bluebird longer than Maya had been alive, her hands permanently pruned from decades of hot water and industrial soap. She hummed while she worked, something old and Spanish that Maya never asked about but had come to associate with home. "Rick, do you smell that?" Maya kept her voice level, professional. Panic spread faster than fire, her professor had once told her. And in a confined space with this many people, panic could kill as efficiently as any explosion. Rick sniffed the air, frowned. "Smell what? The fryer? I changed the oil yesterday." "Not that. Something else. Something sweet and sulfurous." Maya moved closer, her eyes scanning the kitchen. The gas stove dominated the left wall, 6 burners running hot, blue flames dancing beneath pots and pans. The oven below radiated heat. The pilot lights glowed steady. But the smell was definitely stronger here, definitely emanating from somewhere near the cooking line. "You feeling okay, Maya?" Rick's concern was genuine. He was a good man, 50-something with a daughter in college and a wife who brought him lunch on Tuesdays. He'd hired Maya without hesitation when she'd walked in with her incomplete degree and desperate eyes. Had never questioned why someone with her education was asking to waitress. "Maybe you should take a break, get some air." But Maya was already moving, following her nose like a bloodhound, her chemistry training overriding every other instinct. She crouched near the base of the stove, where the gas line connected to the building's main supply. The smell was overwhelming here, making her eyes water. She could taste it at the back of her throat, that distinctive mercaptan additive, methyl mercaptan most likely, with its characteristic rotten egg odor mixed with something sweeter. Natural gas. Leaking. Accumulating. Her mind began running calculations without permission. Natural gas was lighter than air, would rise and collect near the ceiling, would displace oxygen and create a suffocating atmosphere before anyone realized what was happening. But that wasn't the real danger. The real danger was ignition. Natural gas had a flammability range of approximately 5 to 15% in air. Too little and it wouldn't burn. Too much and it would extinguish any flame. But in that perfect middle range, in that deadly sweet spot, a single spark could turn the entire diner into a fireball. She thought of the cigarettes at the door, the electrical outlets, the light switches, the static electricity from shuffling feet on the worn carpet. She thought of the grill, the open flames dancing just feet from where she crouched. She thought of the 37 people in the dining room. She'd counted them automatically during her rounds, and how quickly human bodies burned when exposed to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. "Rick, we need to evacuate. Right now." Maya stood, her voice steady but urgent. "There's a gas leak, and if the concentration gets much higher, anything could ignite it." Rick's face went pale. He'd been a line cook long enough to have heard the stories. The diner explosions that made the evening news. The tragedy that no one saw coming, that always seemed obvious in hindsight. But he was also a man who'd learned to trust Maya's instincts over the past 3 years, who'd watched her fix his broken dishwasher by explaining the chemistry of mineral deposits, who'd seen her prevent a grease fire by understanding flash points and combustion triangles. "What do we do?" he asked, and Maya heard the tremor beneath his words, the fear he was working to control. "First, don't touch any electrical switches. Don't turn anything on or off. Static discharge could ignite the gas." Maya's voice had shifted into something clinical, detached, the same tone her professors had used during emergency drills. "We need to open every door and window we can reach without using anything electrical. We need to get everyone outside calmly but quickly. And we need to shut off the main gas supply if we can locate it." Dolores had stopped scrubbing. She stood with her hands still in the soapy water, her face creased with worry. "The building's gas shutoff is in the basement," she said quietly. "I've seen the maintenance man go down there. It's behind the storage room, near the water heater." Maya nodded. The basement, of course. That meant navigating stairs, finding the valve in the dark, turning it without creating any sparks from metal-on-metal friction. It meant precious seconds while gas continued to accumulate. But it was necessary. They couldn't evacuate and leave the leak active. The fire department would need time to arrive, and in that time the concentration could reach critical levels. "Rick, you start getting people out. Tell them there's a gas leak. Keep them calm, but move fast. Don't let anyone grab their coats or bags near electrical outlets. Dolores, can you open the back door and the kitchen windows?" Both of them moved without question, and Maya felt a surge of gratitude for their trust. She'd never told them about her years at Denver Community College, about the advanced chemistry courses she'd aced, about the research project on industrial safety protocols that had been her specialty before everything fell apart. She'd never explained why a waitress might know the difference between methane and propane, or why she understood the mechanics of thermal runaway reactions. But in this moment, their faith in her was absolute, and that faith might save their lives. She moved through the kitchen toward the basement door, her mind still calculating. The Bluebird Diner was an old building, constructed in the 1960s when building codes were looser and safety regulations were suggestions rather than requirements. The gas line was probably corroded, weakened by decades of thermal expansion and contraction. The leak could have started days ago, small at first, undetectable until today when some shift in pressure or temperature made it worse. Gas had been accumulating in the walls, in the ceiling spaces, in the dead air pockets that old buildings collected like memories. The basement stairs were wooden and creaked under her weight. Maya descended slowly, one hand on the rail, the other holding her phone as a flashlight. The smell was even stronger here, mixing with mildew and dust to create something nauseating and terrifying. She breathed through her mouth, trying not to gag, while her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The basement was a maze of old equipment and forgotten furniture, everything covered in dust and cobwebs. Maya navigated between rusted metal shelving units and cardboard boxes that had melted into shapeless masses from water damage. She could hear the building groaning above her, could hear muffled voices as Rick began the evacuation. Her phone's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a water heater in the corner, its pilot light glowing like a tiny sun. That pilot light was a bomb waiting to explode. If the gas concentration in the basement reached ignition levels, that small flame would trigger a blast that would gut the building from below, would send shrapnel and fire shooting upward through wooden floors and human bodies. Maya's hands began to shake, but she forced them steady. Fear was a chemical reaction too, adrenaline and cortisol flooding her system, preparing her for fight or flight. She chose fight. The gas shutoff valve was exactly where Dolores had said, mounted on a pipe that ran along the basement's back wall. It was a simple quarter-turn valve, red with age and disuse. Maya approached it carefully, aware that her footsteps on the concrete floor could generate static electricity, that her synthetic uniform could hold a charge, that everything about this situation was precarious and deadly. She knelt beside the valve, wrapped both hands around the handle, and pulled. It didn't budge. Years of corrosion had fused the valve into place, had turned a simple safety mechanism into an immovable obstacle. Maya pulled harder, feeling the metal bite into her palms, feeling her muscles strain. Nothing. The valve wouldn't turn, and the gas kept leaking, and somewhere above her, 37 people were trying to evacuate through doors that might already be surrounded by an invisible cloud of flammable vapor. She needed leverage. Maya looked around frantically, her phone's flashlight beam jumping across the basement like a panicked heartbeat. There, a piece of metal pipe, maybe 2 feet long, lying on a shelf near the water heater. She grabbed it, slid it over the valve handle to create a makeshift wrench, and pulled again. The metal groaned. Her arms screamed. And then, with a sound like a sigh, the valve turned. The hissing stopped. Not immediately. Gas that was already in the lines would continue to seep out. But the main flow had been cut. Maya sagged against the wall, her phone slipping from her sweaty hands. She'd done it. The leak was controlled. Now they just needed to ventilate the building and pray that no one had done anything stupid upstairs, that no one had lit a cigarette or flipped a switch or generated the single spark that would turn her victory into ashes. She climbed the stairs on legs that felt disconnected from her body, emerged into the kitchen to find it empty. Rick and Dolores had evacuated. Maya moved through the dining room, checking corners and bathrooms, making sure no one had been left behind in the rush. The room was deserted, chairs pushed back hastily, half-eaten meals abandoned on tables. A child's coloring book lay open near the window, crayons scattered like casualties. Through the front window, she could see the crowd gathered across the street, Rick's arms gesturing as he explained, Dolores comforting the young mother whose children pressed against her legs. Maya walked to the front door and stepped outside, and the fresh air hit her like salvation. She gulped it down, felt the oxygen clear her head, felt the tension in her chest begin to unwind. The sun was too bright after the basement's dimness. The street was too loud, too normal, too beautifully mundane. A bus rumbled past. A dog barked somewhere. Life continued, oblivious to how close it had come to ending. Rick jogged over, his face flushed. "Did you get it? Is it safe?" "The main gas is shut off," Maya said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm for what had just happened. "But the building needs to be ventilated completely before anyone goes back in. We need to call the fire department and the gas company. They need to inspect the lines, find the source of the leak, make sure the structure is sound." Rick nodded, already pulling out his phone. Maya watched him dial, watched the crowd across the street, watched the Bluebird Diner stand silent and still, its windows dark, its sign creaking in the breeze. How many times had she walked through those doors? How many plates had she carried? How many orders had she memorized? How many tips had she counted while her mind wandered to chemical equations and molecular structures? The diner had been her prison and her sanctuary, the place where her dreams went to survive on minimum wage and tired feet. And she had just saved it. The realization came slowly, like sunrise, like the gradual understanding that she hadn't just prevented an explosion. She'd prevented 37 deaths, maybe more. The construction workers who wouldn't burn. The young mother whose children wouldn't be orphaned. Rick, who would see his daughter graduate. Dolores, who would hum tomorrow and the day after that. All of them alive because Maya had recognized a smell, had remembered her training, had acted when action was the difference between survival and catastrophe. But as the adrenaline began to fade, as her hands stopped shaking and her breathing returned to normal, a question began to form in the back of her mind. A question that would haunt her through the hours and days ahead, that would change everything about how she saw herself and her place in this small corner of the world. How long had the gas been leaking before she noticed? How many days had the Bluebird Diner been a ticking bomb, waiting for the wrong person to flip the wrong switch? And if she hadn't been there, if her shift had been different, if she'd called in sick, if she'd never studied chemistry at all, who would have smelled the danger before it was too late? The fire trucks arrived with sirens wailing, and Maya stood aside as firefighters in heavy gear swarmed the building. She answered their questions mechanically, explained about the smell, the basement valve, the need for complete ventilation. They nodded with professional respect, treated her like someone who knew what she was talking about, and she realized that for the first time in 3 years, she was being seen not as a waitress but as what she trained to be, a scientist. Maya's apartment was silent in a way that felt unnatural after the chaos of the afternoon. She sat on her sagging couch, still in her uniform, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been growing for 8 months. The building's superintendent kept promising to fix it, but promises were cheap in this neighborhood, and action required money that neither of them had. The stain looked like a map of something, a country that didn't exist, or maybe a diagram of how dreams eroded under the weight of necessity. The local news played on her tiny television, the sound muted, the anchor's mouth moving soundlessly as footage of the Bluebird Diner rolled across the screen. Yellow caution tape surrounded the building. Firefighters moved in and out. The crowd of evacuees stood in clusters, and Maya could pick out familiar faces. The truckers, the construction workers, the young mother holding her children close. She'd been interviewed by a reporter, had declined, had slipped away while Rick handled the media with the weary competence of someone who'd run a small business for 20 years. Her phone buzzed. Text messages, mostly. Rick, thank God you were there. Take tomorrow off, paid. We'll reopen once it's safe. Dolores. Me on hell, you saved us all. A few others from coworkers who'd heard the news, offering concern and gratitude in equal measure. Maya read them all but didn't reply. She wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to explain that she felt hollowed out, as if preventing the explosion had required burning some essential part of herself as fuel. She stood and walked to her bathroom, a cramped space with tiles that had been white in some previous decade. The mirror reflected someone who looked like Maya Reyes but didn't quite feel like her anymore. She'd washed her hands 3 times, but they still felt dirty, still smelled faintly of that chemical sweetness. She turned on the shower, waited for the water to warm. It took 5 minutes in this building, the pipes groaning like they resented being asked to function, and stepped under the spray with her uniform still on. The fabric grew heavy, clinging to her skin. She watched the water pool around her feet, carrying away the smell and the fear and the strange disconnection she'd felt since walking out of the diner. This was how she processed things, had been since childhood, through water and silence and the simple act of washing away what couldn't be carried. Her mother had understood that about her, had never questioned why Maya took 3 showers on days when exams loomed large, or why she'd spent an hour in the bath after her father's funeral. Her mother, Angela Reyes, dead now for 2 years, buried in a cemetery Maya visited on the first fun day of every month. She brought white roses, her mother's favorite, and talked to the headstone like it could hear her, like death was just another room where her mother waited patiently for her daughter to arrive. They'd been close, impossibly close, bound by the kind of love that mothers and only children share. Maya had been her mother's world, and in return, her mother had been Maya's North Star, the fixed point around which everything else orbited. When the cancer diagnosis came, Stage 4 pancreatic, inoperable, incurable. Maya had been in the third year of her graduate program, 6 months from defending her thesis. She'd been working on chemical safety protocols for industrial facilities, researching how to predict and prevent catastrophic failures in complex systems. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd been trying to prevent disasters in the abstract while the biggest catastrophe of her life bloomed in her mother's pancreas like a flower made of malice. The treatment had been aggressive and pointless. Chemotherapy that made her mother's hair fall out in clumps, radiation that left burns on her skin, clinical trials that promised hope and delivered nothing but expense. Maya had taken a leave of absence from school, had worked 2 jobs to supplement her mother's inadequate insurance, had watched the medical bills pile up like snow in winter, beautiful in their whiteness until you realized you were buried. Her mother had lasted 11 months, long enough to see Maya drop out of graduate school, long enough to make Maya promise, hand gripping her daughters with surprising strength, that she wouldn't sacrifice her future for a past that couldn't be saved. "You're going to do great things," her mother had whispered, voice barely audible over the hospital machines. "You're going to save people, Maya. That's what you were born to do." But great things required money Maya didn't have and time she couldn't spare and a kind of optimism that had died in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and failure. After the funeral, after the bills, after everything, Maya had been left with $17,000 in student loan debt, a half-finished thesis on industrial safety that no professor would sponsor, and a chemistry degree that was technically complete but practically useless without the advanced credentials she'd been 6 months from earning. So she'd started waitressing. It was supposed to be temporary, a stopgap until she could figure out her next move, until she could save enough to maybe go back to school, to finish what she'd started. But temporary had become 3 years, and 3 years had become a life she hadn't meant to build. The Bluebird Diner, with its cracked vinyl booths and stuttering neon sign, had become her entire world. A world where her chemistry knowledge was useful only for understanding why the coffee tasted burnt, or how to remove red wine stains from polyester. Maya finally peeled off her soaked uniform and stood naked under the spray, feeling the water pummel her skin. Her body told the story of 3 years on her feet, calluses on her heels, a permanent ache in her lower back, a scar on her left hand from a plate that had shattered mid-carry. She was 29 years old and already felt ancient, felt like she was living in the future her mother had tried to warn her away from, the future where potential curdled into regret. But today had been different. Today her knowledge had mattered. Today she hadn't been just a waitress who happened to know chemistry. She'd been a chemist who happened to waitress. The distinction felt enormous, a chasm that she'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. She'd saved lives today, not in the abstract, theoretical way her research might have someday saved lives, but immediately, tangibly, with her own hands and her own memory and her own refusal to ignore what her training had taught her to see. She turned off the shower and dried herself with a towel that was threadbare but clean. Her apartment was small, a studio with a kitchen nook and a bathroom that barely fit a toilet and shower. The rent was $850 a month, which was cheap for Denver but still ate half her income. The rest went to student loans, groceries, the bus pass she needed to get to work. She'd been saving for 2 years, had managed to accumulate $3,200 in a savings account that mocked her every time she checked the balance. At her current rate, she might have enough to return to school in a decade. Maya dressed in sweatpants and an old university t-shirt, the logo faded from too many washes. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, the cheap kind, the kind that came in bags that tasted like sadness and hot water, and sat at her small dining table. The table was also her desk, covered with bills she needed to pay and a notebook she used to sketch out chemical structures when she couldn't sleep. It was a habit from graduate school, a kind of meditation, the act of drawing molecules calming her mind in ways that nothing else could. She opened the notebook and began to draw, her pen moving automatically. Methyl mercaptan first, CH3SH, the compound that had saved everyone's lives today by making natural gas detectable. Then methane, CH4, simple, elegant, the primary component of natural gas and the molecule that would have incinerated the diner if she hadn't acted. She drew the structures larger than necessary, filling the page, losing herself in the beauty of atoms and bonds and the invisible architecture that held the world together. Her phone rang, startling her. Unknown number. Maya answered cautiously. "Hello." Ms. Reyes? This is Captain Jennifer Morrison with Denver Fire Department. I was the incident commander at the Bluebird Diner today. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Maya's grip tightened on the phone. Yes, of course. I wanted to personally thank you for your actions today. Our investigation confirmed a significant gas leak from a corroded pipe junction. The concentration in the kitchen was at 7%, right in the middle of the flammability range. If you hadn't shut off the main valve when you did, if anyone had generated a spark, the captain's voice trailed off, the implication clear. I just did what made sense, Maya said, uncomfortable with the praise. What made sense to you required knowledge that most people don't have. We pulled the building records. That gas line was 53 years old, original to the structure. It should have been replaced decades ago. Your background in chemistry, that's what saved lives today. I'm writing a report, and I wanted to make sure I had your credentials correct. You have a bachelor's in chemistry from Denver Community College. Not quite, Maya admitted, the words tasting bitter. I completed my bachelor's, but I was 6 months short of my master's when I had to leave the program. I was working on industrial safety protocols, but I never finished my thesis. There was a pause. When Captain Morrison spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. You know, the fire department has a hazardous materials division. We're always looking for people with chemistry backgrounds, people who can identify risks and respond appropriately. Have you ever considered emergency response work? Maya almost laughed. The question was absurd and painful and exactly what she'd been avoiding for 3 years. I can't afford to get certified. I have student loans, and waitressing barely covers my expenses. Training programs cost money and time I don't have. There are programs, the captain said gently. Grants, scholarships, especially for people with your background and experience. I'm not trying to recruit you on the spot, but what you did today, that was professional-level hazmat response. You have instincts that can't be taught. If you're interested, I could send you some information. No pressure, just options. After they hung up, Maya sat staring at her phone. Options. The word felt foreign, like vocabulary from a language she'd forgotten how to speak. For 3 years, she'd had no options. She'd had obligations and necessities and the grinding routine of survival. But today had cracked something open, had reminded her that she was more than her circumstances, that the knowledge in her head was valuable in ways she'd stopped believing. She looked at the molecular structures in her notebook, at the careful lines and precise angles that represented invisible reality. This was who she was, underneath the uniform and the exhaustion and the deferred dreams. This was the person her mother had believed in, had made her promise not to abandon. Chemist, a scientist, someone who saw the world in terms of reactions and compounds and the beautiful, terrible logic of how things came together or fell apart. Maya turned to a fresh page and began writing. Not molecular structures this time, but a list. Things she'd been putting off. Things she'd told herself were impossible, but that today had revealed as merely difficult. She wrote, contact university about thesis completion. Then, research hazmat certification programs. And finally, call Dr. Hartman if he's still teaching. Dr. Hartman. She hadn't thought about him in years, had been too ashamed to reach out after dropping out. He'd been her thesis advisor, a gentle man in his 60s who'd spent 30 years teaching chemistry to community college students who couldn't afford university tuition. He'd believed in Maya's research, had called her work essential, and exactly the kind of practical application that saves lives. He'd written her recommendation letters, had fought to get her funding, had been the one to call when she stopped showing up to class after her mother's diagnosis. She'd never returned that call, hadn't known what to say, how to explain that she couldn't be the person he thought she was, that her mother's death had taken not just her future but her ability to imagine one. She'd let his calls go to voicemail until they stopped coming, had avoided the community college campus, had pretended that her old life didn't exist because existing in her new one was hard enough without the weight of what she'd lost. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe finishing her thesis wasn't impossible, just difficult. Maybe there was a path from waitressing to something else, something that used the knowledge she'd worked so hard to acquire. Today had proven she still had that knowledge, still had the instincts and training that 3 years of serving coffee hadn't erased. The question was whether she had the courage to believe it mattered. Maya's tea had gone cold. She reheated it in the microwave, a machine that worked because of electromagnetic radiation at 2.45 gigahertz, exciting water molecules until they vibrated with heat. See? She couldn't help herself. Couldn't look at anything without seeing the invisible mechanisms underneath, the chemistry and physics that made the mundane magical. It was a blessing and a curse, this way of seeing, but it was hers, and today it had been the difference between life and death. She took her tea to bed, a futon that served as both couch and mattress, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the day, kept smelling that mercaptan sweetness, kept seeing the pilot light in the basement that could have been everyone's last sight. She thought about the young mother with her 2 children, about how close they'd come to dying without ever knowing danger had found them. She thought about Rick and Dolores, about all the other people whose lives had intersected with hers in that ordinary Thursday that had turned extraordinary. And she thought about her mother, about the promise she'd made in a hospital room that smelled of endings. "You're going to save people, Maya." Her mother had been right, but in a way neither of them had imagined. Not through research or published papers or industrial safety protocols implemented across multiple facilities. Just through being there, through noticing what others missed, through having the knowledge and the will to act when action was everything. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it was more than enough. Maybe her story wasn't over, wasn't defined by what she'd lost or abandoned, but by what she still carried. The training, the instincts, the fundamental understanding of how the world worked at its most basic level. She'd spent 3 years believing she'd failed, that dropping out made her a failure, that waitressing was a waste of her education and potential. But today she'd been exactly where she needed to be, with exactly the knowledge required to prevent catastrophe. If she'd been a researcher in some lab, if she'd finished her degree and gone on to academic success, she wouldn't have been at the Bluebird Diner when it mattered most. She would have been somewhere else, and 37 people might have died because the universe had needed her there, in that moment, with her incomplete degree and her years of chemistry training and her nose that could detect mercaptan at 1 part per billion. Purpose wasn't always what you planned. Sometimes it was what you stumbled into, what you found while looking for something else entirely. Maya's purpose today had been to prevent an explosion, to save lives, to use her knowledge in the most immediate and vital way possible. Tomorrow, her purpose might be different. It might involve finishing her thesis or getting certified in hazmat response, or finding some other way to turn her chemistry degree into something more than regret. Or maybe tomorrow she'd go back to waitressing, would carry plates and refill coffee and smile through the exhaustion. But even if she did, she wouldn't be the same person who'd walked into work yesterday. She'd be someone who'd seen disaster coming and stopped it, someone who'd proven that knowledge had value regardless of where or how it was applied. She'd be someone her mother would have been proud of, someone who'd kept the promise made in a hospital room. Maya finally fell asleep as dawn began to lighten her apartment's single window. She dreamed of molecular structures and flames, of gas leaks and the moment before explosion, of standing in a basement with a corroded valve that wouldn't turn. But in her dream, when she pulled, the valve moved easily, and the hissing stopped, and everyone lived to see another day. When she woke, her phone was full of messages. More from Rick, updating her on the diner's status. Several from coworkers checking in. One from a number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Reyes, this is Jennifer Morrison again. I hope I'm not overstepping, but I sent you some information about the hazmat certification program. No pressure, but I think you'd be extraordinary at this work. You have a gift. Please consider using it. Captain Morrison." Maya read the message 3 times. A gift. She'd never thought of her chemistry knowledge as a gift. Had thought of it as something she'd lost the right to claim when she dropped out of graduate school. But maybe gifts weren't about credentials or complete degrees or academic success. Maybe they were about what you could do when it mattered, about the knowledge you carried and the instincts you honed and the simple fact of being present when the world needed exactly what you had to offer. She made coffee, cheap instant, because real coffee was a luxury, and opened her laptop. The machine was old, took forever to boot up, the fan whirring like it was in pain. But eventually, the screen flickered to life, and Maya opened her email. Captain Morrison's message was there, with attachments labeled hazmat certification programs, financial assistance options, and success stories, non-traditional backgrounds. Maya opened the first file and began to read. The program was 9 months long, a combination of classroom work and field training. It covered everything from chemical identification to emergency response protocols to the legal frameworks governing hazardous materials. The cost was listed, $12,000 for tuition and materials. Maya's heart sank. She had $3,200 saved, which meant she was $8,800 short of impossible. But then she opened the second file, the one about financial assistance. There were grants, scholarships specifically for people with incomplete degrees who wanted to complete their education. There were work-study programs where you could earn while you learned. There were payment plans and deferred tuition and 100 other options she'd never known existed because she'd never looked, had never believed herself worthy of looking. The third file contained stories of people like her. People who'd started in one place and ended up somewhere completely different. People who'd faced obstacles and found ways around them. A former mechanic who became an environmental engineer. A high school dropout who earned a chemistry degree at 40 and now worked for the EPA. A waitress, Maya almost laughed, who'd gone from serving food to managing a hospital's hazmat safety program. Their stories were different from hers, but also somehow the same. They'd all had moments when they could have given up, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable and the dreams too expensive to pursue. But they'd found ways forward, had cobbled together resources and opportunities, and sheer stubborn refusal to let their circumstances define their capabilities. And they'd succeeded not because they were special or lucky, but because they'd been willing to try. Maya closed the laptop and sat in silence. Outside her window, Denver was waking up. Cars starting, people heading to work, the world continuing its rotation with indifferent grace. Somewhere across the city, the Bluebird Diner sat empty, yellow caution tape fluttering in the wind, waiting for the gas company to finish repairs and the fire marshal to sign off on safety. Rick was probably fielding calls from customers, explaining when they'd reopen. Dolores was probably at home, humming her Spanish songs, grateful to be alive. And Maya? Maya was sitting in her studio apartment, holding a cup of instant coffee, staring at a laptop that contained possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine. She was 29 years old with half a graduate degree, $17,000 in student debt, and 3 years of waitressing behind her. She was also the person who'd prevented an explosion yesterday, who'd saved 37 lives with knowledge she thought was wasted, who'd proven that chemistry degrees weren't measured only in papers published or salaries earned, but in moments when understanding the world's invisible architecture meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. She opened her laptop again and began typing an email. The recipient, Dr. Marcus Hartman, if his university address was still active. The subject line, "I'm sorry, and I need help." The body of the message took her an hour to write, deleting and restarting a dozen times before she finally settled on honesty stripped of everything but truth. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Dr. Hartman, I don't know if you remember me. I was your advisee 3 years ago, working on industrial safety protocols. I disappeared without explanation after my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She died, and I couldn't come back, couldn't face the program or the thesis or anything that reminded me of who I'd been trying to become. I've been waitressing at the Bluebird Diner. Yesterday, I identified a gas leak and prevented an explosion. I used everything you taught me. I'm writing because I think I'm ready to finish what I started, but I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if you'd be willing to work with me again, or if my thesis is still viable, or if I'm 3 years too late to salvage anything from the wreckage I made. But I'm asking anyway because yesterday taught me that my knowledge still matters, and maybe that means I still matter too. Maya Reyes. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then immediately wanted to delete it, to recall the message and hide back in the safety of not trying. But the email was gone, launched into digital space, and there was no taking it back. She'd asked for help, had admitted she needed it, had put herself out there in a way she hadn't done since her mother's funeral. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of anxiety and caffeine. Maya cleaned her apartment, scrubbing at stains that wouldn't come out, organizing cabinets that didn't need organizing. She did laundry in the building's basement machines, feeding quarters into slots while her clothes tumbled, while she tried not to think about basements or gas valves or the way her hands had shaken when the valve finally turned. Her phone rang at noon. "Rick." She answered on the third ring. "Maya, thank God. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she lied automatically. "How's the diner?" "Gas company finished repairs this morning. Fire marshal inspected everything. We're cleared to reopen tomorrow." Rick's voice was thick with emotion. "They said you were right about everything, the corroded pipe, the concentration levels, the timing. If you'd noticed even 30 minutes later, the concentration would have been too high to ventilate safely. They would have had to blow out the building deliberately just to prevent an uncontrolled explosion." Maya absorbed this information in silence. 30 minutes. The difference between saving a building and destroying it, between 37 people walking away and 37 bodies pulled from rubble. Timing, like so much in chemistry, was everything. "Maya, I know I told you to take tomorrow off, but there are reporters who want to talk to you. Local news, even a couple of the Denver papers. You're a hero, and people want to hear your story." "I'm not a hero," Maya said reflexively. "I just happened to know what I was smelling." "That's exactly why you're a hero. Just happened to know saved all our lives." Rick paused. "You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. I can handle it. But I thought you should know people are interested. What you did matters, Maya. It matters a lot." After they hung up, Maya sat with the weight of that word. Hero. It didn't fit right. Felt too large for someone who'd simply applied knowledge she'd acquired in classrooms, who'd done what any competent chemist would have done in the same situation. But then again, how many competent chemists were working as waitresses at old diners with corroded gas lines? How many would have been there at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right training, with noses calibrated to detect mercaptan at 1 part per billion? Maybe heroism wasn't about being extraordinary. Maybe it was about being ordinary in an extraordinary moment, about having prepared without knowing what you were preparing for, about being exactly who you needed to be when the universe demanded it. Her mother had believed in destiny, had told Maya that everyone had a purpose even if they didn't know what it was yet. Maya had dismissed it as the kind of thing dying people said to comfort themselves, to believe their suffering meant something. But what if her mother had been right? What if every choice Maya had made, studying chemistry, specializing in industrial safety, even dropping out to care for her mother, had been preparing her for yesterday? What if her purpose wasn't to publish groundbreaking research or revolutionize safety protocols, but simply to be at the Bluebird Diner on a Thursday afternoon when 37 lives hung in the balance? Her laptop chimed. Email notification. Maya's heart jumped. Dr. Hartman, responding already, which meant he was either eager to help or eager to tell her no. She opened the message with her eyes half closed, like a child watching a scary movie. Maya, of course I remember you. You were one of the brightest students I've taught in 30 years, and your disappearance broke my heart. I called, I emailed, I even stopped by your mother's house before learning she'd passed. I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm sorry that you felt you couldn't reach out, but I understand why you didn't. Grief is a compound that doesn't follow predictable reactions. I saw the news about the Bluebird Diner. I saw that a waitress named Maya Reyes prevented a disaster, and I knew it was you even before they mentioned your chemistry background. Of course, your thesis is still viable. The question you were researching, how to predict and prevent catastrophic failures in aging industrial infrastructure, is more relevant than ever. Half the gas lines in this country are over 50 years old, ticking time bombs waiting for someone who knows enough to notice. Your work could save countless lives. I'm retired now, but I still have advisory privileges at the college. If you want to finish your master's, I'll help you. If you want to publish your research, I'll co-author. If you just want to talk, I'm here for that too. You didn't make a wreckage, Maya. You made a detour, and now you're finding your way back to the path. Welcome home, Dr. Hartman. Maya read the email 3 times, tears blurring the screen. Welcome home. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed someone to say that, to tell her that leaving hadn't been failing, that the last 3 years hadn't been waste but preparation. Dr. Hartman was offering her a way back, a path from waitressing to science, from survival to purpose. All she had to do was take it. But taking it meant confronting everything she'd been avoiding. The incomplete thesis, the student loans, the gap in her resume that she'd have to explain to future employers. It meant admitting she'd been wrong to hide, wrong to convince herself her knowledge didn't matter, wrong to let grief and fear make her small. It meant being brave in a way she hadn't been since her mother's diagnosis, when she'd made the choice to leave school and care for the woman who'd given her everything. Maya typed a response with shaking fingers. Dr. Hartman, thank you. Yes to all of it, finishing the thesis, publishing, talking. I want to do the work. I want to finish what I started. I don't know how yet, but I'm willing to figure it out. Can we meet next week? I have so many questions, and I need your help navigating what comes next. Maya, send. Another email launched into digital space. Another bridge built across the gap between who she'd been and who she might become. Maya closed the laptop and sat in the afternoon silence of her apartment, feeling something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope, cautious and fragile and easily broken, but hope nonetheless. The Bluebird Diner reopened Friday morning to a line that stretched around the block. Maya arrived early, wearing her uniform freshly washed and pressed, her hair pulled back in the same bun she'd worn for 3 years. But everything felt different now. The diner felt smaller somehow, less permanent, like a way station rather than a destination. Rick greeted her with a hug that lasted longer than comfortable. His eyes wet with gratitude he didn't try to hide. You sure you want to work today? He asked. After everything? I need the money, Maya said simply. And the routine. If I stay home, I'll just think too much. The customers were different too. They looked at Maya with recognition, with a kind of reverence that made her skin prickle with discomfort. The story had made the evening news, had been featured in the Denver Post under the headline Waitress's chemistry degree saves lives. The article included her picture, a photo Rick had taken last Christmas at the staff party, Maya smiling with her arm around Dolores, both of them wearing Santa hats. She looked happy in the photo, genuinely happy, and that made it worse somehow. Like proof that she'd been lying to herself about how unhappy she was. By 10 a.m., 3 reporters had shown up asking for interviews. Rick politely deflected them, but Maya could feel their presence. Their cameras pointed at the diner. Their hunger for the story of the hero waitress who'd saved everyone with science. It was the kind of feel-good narrative that played well. Education triumphing over circumstance, knowledge saving lives, the American dream validated through crisis. But Maya didn't feel like a validation of anything. She felt like someone who'd done what needed doing and now didn't know what came next. The lunch rush brought more familiar faces than usual. Regulars who'd been evacuated Thursday, coming back to see the place that almost killed them, to eat in a space that had been simultaneously mundane and deadly. Maya took their orders and listened to their stories, how they'd told their families, how close they'd felt to disaster without knowing it, how grateful they were that someone had noticed. A construction worker named Tommy, who'd been there Thursday with his crew, grabbed Maya's wrist as she set down his coffee. My daughter's 5, he said, voice rough. I would have died never seeing her grow up, and I wouldn't have even known I was in danger. You gave me the chance to go home to see her again. I don't know how to thank you for that. Maya gently extracted her wrist, unsure how to respond. You don't need to thank me. I'm glad you're okay. But Tommy wasn't finished. My crew and I, we've been talking. We work construction, we see old buildings all the time, pipes and lines that should have been replaced decades ago. Nobody checks. Nobody cares until something goes wrong. What you did, identifying that leak, that's a skill. You should be doing inspections, not waiting tables. It was the third person in 2 days to suggest Maya should be doing something else, something that used her education more directly. Captain Morrison, Dr. Hartman, now Tommy. The universe seemed determined to push her toward a future she wasn't sure she deserved or could achieve. But the suggestions kept coming, kept accumulating like pressure in a pipe, making it harder to pretend she could stay where she was. By 2 p.m., Maya was exhausted. The emotional weight of being seen, being recognized, being called a hero by strangers who wanted to shake her hand or buy her coffee. It was more draining than any double shift she'd worked. She retreated to the kitchen during a lull, finding Dolores at her usual station, hands submerged in hot soapy water. "You okay, Mija?" Dolores asked without looking up from the dishes. "Everyone keeps calling me a hero," Maya said. "I hate it. Because you don't think you are? Or because you're scared of what comes next if you believe them?" The question hit harder than Maya expected. Dolores had always been perceptive, had a way of seeing through the walls people built. She'd been the first person at the diner to ask about Maya's education, to notice the chemistry textbook Maya sometimes read during breaks. She'd never pressed, never made Maya feel ashamed of waitressing with a college degree, but she'd always known there was more to Maya's story than the uniform suggested. "Both," Maya admitted. "I did what anyone with my training would do. That doesn't make me special. But not everyone has your training, do they? And you didn't have to use it. You could have ignored the smell, convinced yourself it was nothing, gone home after your shift. But you didn't. You acted, you saved us, and now you have to live with being the kind of person who does that." Dolores finally looked up, her weathered hands dripping suds. "That's what scares you, I think. Not that people see you as a hero, but that you might actually be one." Maya had no response to that. She grabbed a towel and began drying dishes, the routine comforting in its familiarity. But Dolores's words stayed with her, burrowing into the spaces where doubt lived. What did it mean to be heroic? Was it a single moment of action? Or did it require something more sustained, something that changed who you were fundamentally? The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 40s, wearing a business suit and carrying a leather folder, walked into the diner and asked specifically for Maya. Rick pointed her out, and the woman approached table 6 where Maya was refilling water glasses. "Ms. Reyes? My name is Patricia Chen. I'm a producer with Rocky Mountain News Network. We're doing a segment on everyday heroes, and your story is exactly what we're looking for. Would you be willing to sit for an interview? We could film here at the diner, or at a location of your choice." Maya set down the water pitcher carefully. "I don't think I'm interested in being on television. I understand your reluctance, but hear me out." Patricia slid into the booth uninvited, gesturing for Maya to sit across from her. "Your story is more than just a feel-good news piece. You represent something important, the value of education, the potential that exists in unexpected places. You're a waitress with a chemistry degree who saved lives. That resonates with people, especially in a time when higher education is being dismissed as useless or elitist." "My degree isn't complete," Maya said, the admission automatic. "I dropped out of my master's program." "Even better," Patricia said, and Maya bristled at the enthusiasm. "You're someone who faced obstacles and still managed to use your knowledge meaningfully. That's the story, not that education guarantees success, but that knowledge has value regardless of credentials. We want to feature you, talk about your background, your mother's illness, the decision to leave school, and how your training saved lives despite everything." Maya felt her defenses rising. "My mother's illness isn't content for your news segment. I'm not trying to exploit your pain," Patricia said more gently. "I'm trying to show that life is complicated, that people make sacrifices, and that those sacrifices don't negate the value of what they've learned or who they are. Your story matters, Maya. It could inspire other people who feel trapped or like their education was wasted. It could save lives if it encourages even one person to finish their degree or use their knowledge." The argument was persuasive, and Maya hated that. She didn't want to be inspiring. She didn't want strangers to know about her mother or her debt or the 3 years she'd spent pretending she didn't miss chemistry with an ache that never fully subsided. But Patricia was right about one thing. If her story could help someone else, could encourage them to finish what they'd started or believe their knowledge mattered, maybe the discomfort was worth it. "I need to think about it," Maya said finally. "Can I call you?" Patricia handed her a business card. "Take all the time you need. But Maya, what you did was remarkable. You should be proud, not hiding in a uniform." After Patricia left, Maya stood in the center of the diner, business card in hand, feeling like she was standing at a crossroads she hadn't asked to reach. Every direction led somewhere new, somewhere that required her to be someone different than who she'd been yesterday. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of transformation, even if everyone else seemed convinced she was. The weekend passed in a blur of work and worry. Maya picked up extra shifts, partly for the money and partly to avoid sitting alone with her thoughts. Dr. Hartman emailed again, setting up a meeting for Tuesday afternoon at the community college. Captain Morrison called to follow up on the hazmat certification information, casual and friendly, never pushing but making it clear the offer was real if Maya wanted it. And through it all, Maya felt herself being pulled in directions she hadn't chosen, felt the weight of expectation pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. People wanted her to be something, a hero, an inspiration, a symbol of education's value. But Maya just wanted to be herself, whoever that was underneath the accumulated layers of grief and survival and minimum wage exhaustion. Monday brought a development that changed everything. Maya was working the breakfast shift when two men in suits walked into the diner. They weren't typical customers. Too clean, too official, carrying themselves with the kind of authority that made everyone notice. They asked for Rick, were shown to his office in the back, and emerged 20 minutes later with expressions Maya couldn't read. Rick called Maya into his office after they left. He looked shaken, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured for her to sit. "Those were building inspectors," he said without preamble. "City officials. They've been reviewing the Bluebird's infrastructure after the gas leak. Maya, it's not good. The gas line wasn't the only problem. The electrical is outdated, fire code violations everywhere, structural issues with the foundation. They're giving me 30 days to bring everything up to code, or they'll revoke our occupancy permit." Maya's stomach dropped. How much will that cost? 200,000 minimum. Maybe more. Rick's voice was hollow. "I don't have that kind of money. The diner barely breaks even most months. My savings might cover 50,000 if I liquidate everything, but even then..." He trailed off, the math too devastating to complete. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the Bluebird might be closing permanently. I'm saying that gas leak you caught, it saved lives, but it also might have killed the diner. The inspection you triggered found everything else wrong. All the violations I've been ignoring because I couldn't afford to fix them. And now I'm out of time." Maya sat in stunned silence. She'd saved the diner from explosion only to condemn it to closure through the inspection process. The irony was bitter and inescapable. If she'd done nothing, if she'd ignored the smell, the diner might have exploded. But it also might not have. The timing could have been different, the concentration lower, the disaster avoided through luck rather than intervention. And Rick would still have his business, still have his livelihood, still have the thing he'd built over 20 years. "This isn't your fault," Rick said, reading her expression. "You did the right thing, Maya. If we'd exploded, people would have died. A building can be replaced. Lives can't. But I wanted you to know what's happening. Why things are going to be difficult over the next month." "What will you do?" Maya asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Try to find investors, I guess. Take out loans I probably can't repay. Pray for a miracle." Rick managed a weak smile. The same thing everyone does when they're drowning and can't see land. Maya left his office feeling like she'd been punched. She finished her shift mechanically, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences. The Bluebird closing meant she'd be unemployed, would have to find another waitressing job in a city where those jobs were plentiful but paid the same poverty wages everywhere. It meant Dolores would be without work at 72, might not find another position at her age. It meant the regulars would lose their daily gathering place, the truckers and construction workers and young mothers who'd made the diner their community. And it was all because Maya had noticed the smell and acted on it. Because she'd had knowledge and used it. Because she'd been exactly who she was supposed to be in the moment crisis required it. She'd saved lives and destroyed livelihoods, had prevented one disaster while triggering another. The complexity of that, the impossible moral calculus, made her head ache and her chest tight with something between guilt and righteousness. That evening, Maya walked to the cemetery. She hadn't planned to. It was Monday, and she only visited on fun days. But she needed to talk to her mother, needed to confess to the marble headstone that held Angela Reyes's name and the dates that bookend her too short life. The cemetery was quiet, empty except for Maya and the dead. She sat on the grass in front of her mother's grave, cross-legged like a child, and talked to the stone like it could hear her. I saved people, Mom, just like you said I would. But I also might have ruined their lives in a different way. The diner's closing because of what I did, because I triggered an inspection that found all the violations Rick couldn't afford to fix. And I don't know if I did the right thing anymore. I don't know if preventing an explosion that might never have happened was worth destroying the place that's been my home for 3 years. The stone didn't answer, but Maya felt something settle in her chest anyway, some clarity emerging from the confusion. Her mother had been a nurse, had spent 30 years caring for people who were sick and scared and sometimes dying. She'd once told Maya that medicine was about making impossible choices, about weighing risks and benefits in situations where every option had consequences. You do your best, she'd said, and then you live with the outcomes, because that's all anyone can do. Maya had done her best. She'd identified a gas leak, had prevented an explosion that would have killed everyone in the diner. She couldn't have known about the other violations, couldn't have predicted that saving the building from fire would expose it to closure through bureaucracy. She'd acted on the information she had with the training she possessed in the moment that required both. That wasn't wrong. It was just complicated, the way real life was complicated, the way moral choices never fit neatly into right or wrong but existed somewhere in the messy middle. I'm going to try to help, Maya said to the stone. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to try to save the bluebird the same way I saved the people in it. Because that's what you would have done, Mom. You would have found a way to make things better, even when it seemed impossible. She stayed until the sun set, until the cemetery closed and the security guard politely told her she needed to leave. Walking home, Maya felt something shift inside her, some fundamental recalibration of who she was and what she was capable of. She'd spent 3 years being small, being invisible, being someone who just survived rather than thrived. But crisis had revealed her, had stripped away the protective layers and shown her, and everyone else, that she was more than her circumstances suggested. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to be the person her mother had believed she was, the person Dr. Hartman had seen potential in, the person Captain Morrison thought could do extraordinary things. Maybe saving the bluebird meant saving herself first, meant finishing her degree and opening doors that had seemed permanently closed. Maybe individual acts of heroism weren't enough. Maybe she needed to become someone who could prevent future disasters, who could identify aging infrastructure before it failed, who could use her knowledge systematically rather than accidentally. Tuesday afternoon, Maya met Dr. Hartman at Denver Community College in a coffee shop near campus. He looked older than she remembered, his hair whiter, his face more lined, but his eyes were the same, sharp and kind and full of the patient intelligence that made him beloved by students who usually felt overlooked by the education system. Maya, he said, standing to hug her. It's good to see you. They sat and talked for 2 hours. Dr. Hartman explained the process for re-enrolling, finishing her thesis, and ultimately defending for her master's degree. It would take approximately 9 months if she worked full-time on it, less if she could dedicate more hours. The thesis she'd started, Predictive Models for Catastrophic Failure in Aging Industrial Infrastructure, was still viable, still relevant, perhaps even more so after the Bluebird incident. Your case study is sitting right there, Dr. Hartman said, gesturing toward the window where the city sprawled beyond. The Bluebird Diner, a 53-year-old building with original gas lines and multiple code violations. You could document the leak, the inspection findings, the infrastructure failures, and develop a predictive model based on building age, maintenance records, and environmental factors. It's exactly the kind of practical research that saves lives. Maya's mind raced. If she could finish her thesis, if she could turn the Bluebird disaster into research that helped identify other buildings at risk, she'd be doing something meaningful with her education. She'd be preventing future explosions, future closures, future moments when someone noticed a smell just barely in time. It was the purpose she'd been looking for, the way to honor both her mother's faith and her own long-deferred dreams. There's one problem, Maya said. I can't afford tuition, and I need to work full-time. The diner's probably closing, which means I'll need to find another job just to survive, let alone pay for classes. Dr. Hartman leaned back, steepling his fingers. There are options. Research grants, teaching assistantships, work-study programs. Your story has gotten attention. I've had 3 department heads ask me about you already. People want to support you, Maya. They want to see you succeed. You just have to be willing to ask for help. Asking for help. The thing Maya had avoided for 3 years. The thing that felt like admitting defeat. But maybe asking wasn't weakness. Maybe it was strength, the recognition that no one succeeded alone, that every achievement was built on support from others who believed in what you were trying to do. Her mother had taught her that, had accepted help from neighbors during chemo, had let Maya drop out of school without guilt because she knew her daughter needed to give that care. Asking for help was just another form of love, another way of saying, I trust you to see me, to support me, to help me become who I'm trying to be. Okay, Maya said. Tell me what I need to do. They spent the next hour mapping out a plan. Dr. Hartman would reach out to the dean about emergency financial assistance. Maya would apply for research grants and fellowships aimed at non-traditional students. She'd restructure her thesis to include the Bluebird case study, would interview Rick and the fire marshal and building inspectors to gather data. She'd work on her degree while continuing to Waitress, would split her time between scholarship and survival until she could transition fully into research. It was ambitious and exhausting and probably impossible. But it was also a path forward, a direction that led somewhere other than stagnation. Maya left the meeting feeling electrified, feeling like she'd been asleep for 3 years and was finally waking up. Wednesday brought another complication. Maya was working the dinner shift when Patricia Chun walked back into the diner, this time with a camera crew. Rick was at table 9 taking orders, and Maya was pouring coffee when Patricia approached. Maya, I know you said you needed time to think, but we're filming a segment tonight and I really believe your story should be part of it. Just 10 minutes, you tell us what happened, what you're doing now, how your chemistry degree saved lives. That's it. No exploitation. No sensationalism. Just your story in your words. Maya wanted to say no. She wanted to finish her shift and go home and continue being invisible. But she thought about what Dr. Hartman had said, about people wanting to support her, about her story having the power to inspire others. She thought about the Bluebird closing and the need for money Rick didn't have and the possibility that publicity might help, might bring investors or donations or some kind of miracle. If I do this, Maya said slowly, can you mention the Bluebird? Can you talk about how the diner's closing because of violations the inspection found, and how we need help to save it? Patricia's eyes sharpened with interest. Absolutely. That's an even better angle. Hero saves lives but loses her workplace in the process. Community coming together to help. That's compelling television. Maya felt dirty agreeing to it, felt like she was using tragedy for publicity. But Rick needed help, and Dolores needed help, and all the people who depended on the Bluebird needed help. If telling her story could provide that, if being uncomfortable for 10 minutes could make a difference, wasn't she obligated to try? Okay, she said. Let's do it. The interview was harder than she expected. Patricia asked about her mother, about dropping out, about the 3 years of waitressing. Maya answered honestly, voice shaking, feeling exposed in a way that made her want to run. But she also talked about the gas leak, about recognizing the mercaptan additive, about shutting off the valve and evacuating the building. She explained chemistry in simple terms, made it accessible and real, and showed that education wasn't just theory but practical knowledge that could save lives in moments of crisis. And then she talked about the Bluebird closing, about Rick's impossible situation, about the need for help that she wasn't sure would come but was willing to ask for anyway. If anyone watching can help, Maya said directly to the camera, whether through donations or expertise or just spreading the word. The Bluebird Diner has been a community space for 40 years. It deserves a chance to survive. We all deserve that chance. The segment aired Friday evening during the local news. Maya watched it at home, alone, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold. Seeing herself on television was surreal. She looked tired, vulnerable, but also determined in a way she hadn't recognized while filming. She looked like someone who'd survived something and refused to be broken by it. She looked like a person her mother would have been proud of. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Saturday morning, the The diner had received calls from 3 different construction companies offering discounted services. A local architect volunteered to redesign the space to meet code requirements. 2 people claimed to be investors interested in helping Rick finance the repairs. The Denver Post ran a follow-up story, and by Monday, a GoFundMe campaign started by a complete stranger had raised $47,000 toward the Bluebird's repair costs. Maya watched it happen with a mixture of amazement and discomfort. She'd asked for help and help had arrived, more than she'd imagined possible. Strangers cared about a diner they'd never visited because a waitress with a chemistry degree had saved lives there and then fought to save the building itself. It was beautiful and overwhelming and proof that stories mattered, that being vulnerable could create connections that changed outcomes. But it also meant she couldn't hide anymore, couldn't go back to being invisible, couldn't pretend she was just a waitress with no ambitions beyond surviving each shift. She'd stepped into visibility, into purpose, and there was no stepping back without betraying everything she'd fought for. Rick called a staff meeting Tuesday morning before the diner opened. Everyone was there: Maya, Dolores, the 2 other waitresses, the prep cook who worked mornings. Rick stood at the front with tears in his eyes and a smile that wouldn't quit. "Because of Maya, because she told our story, we have a chance," he said simply. "The donations, the volunteers, the discounted services, together they're enough. We can make the repairs. We can meet code. We can stay open. The Bluebird isn't closing. We're going to survive." Everyone applauded, hugged, cried. Maya felt Dolores's arms around her, the old woman murmuring prayers in Spanish against her hair. She'd done this, not alone, never alone, but she'd been the catalyst, the spark that ignited community support. She'd saved the Bluebird twice now, once from explosion and once from closure. And in doing so, she'd saved herself, had proven that her knowledge and her voice and her story had power she'd been too scared to claim. That afternoon, Maya got another email from Dr. Hartman. The dean approved emergency financial assistance. Full tuition covered for 1 year while you complete your thesis. Stipend for living expenses too. Congratulations, Maya. You're going back to school. You're going to finish what you started. MH. Maya read the email 3 times, then pressed her face into her hands and sobbed. Relief and joy and terror mixed together, creating something she couldn't name but felt in every cell. She was going back. She was finishing her degree. She was becoming the person her mother had believed she could be, the person she'd spent 3 years trying not to want to be because wanting hurt too much when achieving seemed impossible. But impossible was just another calculation, another problem to be solved with the right variables and sufficient determination. Maya had stopped an explosion. She'd saved a diner. She'd asked for help and received it. She could finish a thesis. She could earn her master's. She could use her chemistry degree to identify aging infrastructure before it failed, could prevent future disasters, could be exactly who she'd trained to be before grief derailed everything. She could do this. She would do this. And 3 years from now, when she stood in a different place, she'd look back on this moment, sitting in her studio apartment with an email that changed everything, and recognize it as the turning point, the moment she chose to fight for her future instead of just surviving her present. 3 years later, Dr. Maya Reyes stood before a conference of safety engineers, presenting her research on predictive models for infrastructure failure. Her thesis had been published, cited in new building codes across Colorado. She consulted for the fire department now, taught chemistry at the community college, and had prevented 4 more disasters by identifying aging systems before they failed. The Bluebird Diner still stood, renovated and safe, with a plaque by the door, "Where science saved lives." Dolores still hummed while washing dishes. Rick still flipped pancakes. And Maya still visited sometimes, not as a waitress but as the person she'd always been underneath. A chemist who saw the invisible architecture holding the world together. Her mother had been right. She'd saved people. Not just once, but again and again, by refusing to let circumstance define capability. By finishing what she started. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.